There is another layer to overthinking that most people rarely notice. The brain does not only search for answers, it also searches for closure. Closure feels like a completed loop. The situation is understood, the outcome is known, and the mind can finally move on. But many situations in life never provide this kind of clean ending. Conversations end without full clarity. Relationships fade without explanation. Opportunities disappear without a clear reason. When closure does not appear, the brain continues searching for it. It begins replaying memories and conversations, looking for clues that might explain what happened. It asks questions that have no clear answers. What did I miss? What should I have said? What could I have done differently? These questions feel important in the moment. They feel like the key to understanding the past, but often they simply keep the mind tied to events that are already finished. The brain struggles to accept unfinished stories. Another pattern appears when overthinking becomes connected to identity. People begin to believe that thinking deeply is part of who they are. They may even take pride in their ability to analyze situations from many angles. At first, this seems like a strength. Thoughtfulness, awareness, and reflection can be valuable qualities. But when thinking becomes constant, it stops being a strength and becomes a habit. The mind begins analyzing everything automatically. Every conversation, every decision, every small interaction becomes another subject for review. Eventually, the brain treats life like a puzzle that must be solved before it can be lived. Yet life rarely works like a puzzle. Many of the most meaningful experiences happen without complete understanding. Friendships form without perfect planning. Opportunities appear unexpectedly. Some of the most important moments in life arrive without warning. Overthinking tries to create control over something that was never meant to be completely controlled. There is also a subtle fear hidden beneath many patterns of overthinking. The fear of making the wrong choice. When the mind believes every decision must be correct, it begins searching for the perfect option. It compares possibilities endlessly, trying to identify the safest path. But the search for the perfect decision can become its own trap. Every option contains uncertainty. Every direction includes risks that cannot be fully predicted. The brain continues analyzing because it hopes that one more round of thinking will reveal the correct answer. But perfect answers rarely appear. Eventually, the person becomes stuck between choices, unable to move forward because the mind keeps asking for more information. This is why overthinking often leads to stagnation. Instead of creating clarity, it creates hesitation. The mind keeps preparing for action, but never feels completely ready to take it. There is an interesting psychological shift that happens when people finally recognize this pattern. They begin to realize that thinking does not always reduce uncertainty. Sometimes thinking simply magnifies it. The more possibilities the brain imagines, the more complicated the situation appears. A decision that once felt simple begins to feel overwhelming. This is why clarity often returns when the mind stops analyzing for a while. Distance allows the brain to reset. When attention moves away from the loop of thinking, the nervous system begins calming down. The brain no longer feels the urgency to solve the situation immediately. And once that urgency fades, something surprising can happen. The answer that seemed impossible to find earlier may suddenly appear obvious. This does not mean the brain discovered new information. It simply stopped distorting the situation through endless analysis. Another hidden feature of overthinking is how it interacts with memory. When the mind repeatedly revisits the same situation, it slowly reshapes the memory itself. Details become exaggerated. Emotions become amplified. Small moments that once felt insignificant begin to feel much more important. The brain constructs a more dramatic version of the story. Over time, the person may feel even more emotionally connected to the event than they originally were. This is why overthinking about the past can become emotionally exhausting. The mind is not just remembering the event, it is continuously rebuilding it. And each time the story is reconstructed, it can grow slightly more intense. Understanding this pattern can be surprisingly freeing. It reveals that many of the thoughts that feel so urgent are actually part of a mental habit, rather than a real problem demanding immediate attention. The brain learned to repeat these loops because it believed they were useful. But habits can change. The mind gradually adapts to whatever patterns we repeat consistently. If someone spends years responding to uncertainty with more thinking, the brain becomes very skilled at generating thoughts. But if someone begins responding differently, the brain slowly learns a new response. At first, the change feels unnatural. The mind may resist stillness because it is unfamiliar. It may try to return to the old pattern of analysis. This resistance is normal. The brain is simply following a pathway it has used many times before. But each time the person notices the loop and gently steps away from it, the pathway becomes slightly weaker. Over time, a different pattern becomes easier. The mind begins recognizing that not every thought requires attention. Some thoughts are simply background noise. Just as the body occasionally produces random sensations that do not mean anything important, the brain also produces random thoughts that do not require action. Learning to observe these thoughts without immediately engaging with them changes the relationship we have with our own mind. Instead of being pulled into every mental story, we begin watching them appear and disappear. This shift can feel subtle at first, but it has a powerful effect on how the mind experiences everyday life. Moments that were once filled with analysis become quieter. The mind begins focusing more on the present environment, rather than on imagined futures or reconstructed pasts. Many people describe this experience as clarity, not because every question has been answered, but because the mind is no longer trying to answer every possible question at once. There is a kind of intelligence in allowing certain uncertainties to remain unresolved. Life continues unfolding even when the brain does not fully understand every detail. Another helpful realization is that the mind often confuses importance with attention. Just because a thought appears repeatedly does not mean it is meaningful. It simply means the brain has practiced that thought many times. Repetition can create the illusion of significance, but significance comes from the actual impact something has on life, not from how often the mind revisits it. When this distinction becomes clear, many thought loops begin losing their power. The brain starts recognizing that some questions do not need answers. They only need distance. As the mind becomes less attached to solving every hypothetical problem, something else becomes possible. Presence. Presence means experiencing what is happening right now, rather than mentally living inside a simulation of what might happen later. This does not require forcing the mind into silence. It simply involves redirecting attention to the immediate environment. The sounds in the room, the sensation of breathing, the feeling of movement when walking. These small anchors help the brain reconnect with reality instead of imaginary scenarios. The mind slowly learns that not every moment must be filled with analysis. Stillness becomes less uncomfortable. In fact, many people discover that stillness feels surprisingly natural once the mind stops resisting it. The brain finally gets a chance to rest. And when the mind is rested, thinking becomes clearer when it is actually needed. Instead of endless loops, thoughts become more purposeful. Reflection becomes something you choose, rather than something that happens automatically. And this shift changes the entire relationship we have with our own thinking. The mind is no longer the place where we become trapped. It becomes a tool we can step into when needed, and step away from when the situation calls for quiet. At that point, overthinking loses much of its influence. The brain begins trusting that life can continue even without constant mental supervision. And once the mind understands that, something remarkable begins to happen. Relaxation stops feeling like something you must force. It becomes the natural state the brain returns to when it no longer feels responsible for solving every possible future. In that quiet space, clarity often appears on its own. Not because the brain worked harder to find it, but because the mind finally stopped standing in its own way.